Okay, hello everyone. I'm doing this video in particular for three students, for Caitlin, for Jess and for Tom, who missed yesterday's lesson. I'm just basically picking up where we left off. We're looking at the topic of deciding Germany's future, which was covering two lessons. And the first lesson we got as far as the Yalta Agreement. So the focus of this particular lesson is starting with Potsdam and going through to the London Conference. Okay, so although it's specifically designed for the three students who missed yesterday's lesson, it will be of general use to other students as well, I am sure, I hope. Okay, so let's move on. Just wanted to take a look at the map. It is important for this particular depth study just to be aware of the map of Europe and how it changed after the Second World War. What this map shows, obviously it shows there how Germany was divided into three zones, but the thing I wanted just to remind people of is the border changes at the end of the Second World War. The shaded area there that you're looking at is territory that was taken from Germany at the end of World War II. Okay, if you could try to sort of imagine the old border of Germany, which I'll mark on here, I'll just use a different colour if you just wait for me to change pens. But the old border of Germany was this border here. Okay, so you think about where Berlin is. Berlin was relatively central to Germany in the old Germany. Okay, much more central. And remember also the old Germany, this area here was part of the old Germany. Okay, so the area which is shaded here. That's what was called East Prussia. So the old Poland was, you've got to imagine, again, I'll use a slightly different colour here just so it doesn't get too confusing. I'll just shift to green. But the old Poland was here. Now what basically happened at the end of World War II is, of course, the Soviet Union advanced from the east because, of course, the Nazis had occupied Poland during World War II, and so Poland was liberated by Soviet forces that pushed through Poland into Germany. And of course, the Americans and the British and the French, or the Americans and the British, advanced from the west. Now, specifically in terms of the Germany's eastern borders, at the end of the war, the Soviet Union basically annexed territory from Poland. So they took the new border between the Poland and the Soviet Union, I've just drawn it there in red. So basically Poland lost territory to the Soviet Union in the east, but Poland's borders were shifted to the River Oder and the River Neisse. So this territory that is shaded grey was taken from Germany and given to Poland. And likewise, Poland acquired the territory in grey, that territory there. So the old Polish corridor, which you've got to imagine that sort of area there, was that was the part of Poland that literally had divided Germany into two before World War II. That effectively disappeared from the map. And if you've got to try to imagine it, what has basically happened there, because Poland lost territory in the east to the Soviet Union, but gained territory in the west from Germany, effectively it was as if the country of Poland shifted westwards. Okay, now, because the net effect of that is, of course, Germany shrunk. Okay, Germany was a smaller country, as well as being a country that was under military occupation at the end of the Second World War. But the implications for Berlin, of course, is that Berlin was, in terms of the map of Europe, was much more to the east. Berlin was relatively close to their eastern border with Poland at the end of the war. So Berlin was in terms of a capital of Germany, was much less central. Okay, so that's that, and that's relevant because at a later stage we'll start talking about population movements and expellees and refugees and so on and so forth, and so understanding the shift of Poland in a westwards direction is relevant. So I just wanted to start off with that. And then there's the other map, which we'll obviously pick up and talk about in more detail as we go through. But that map shows the military occupation arrangement at the end of the Second World War. So as you can see, Germany was divided into four zones: the British zone in the northwest, the relatively small French zone in blue in the southwest, the American zone in the southeast, that's yellow, and the Russian, the Soviet zone in the northeast. And of course the capital of Berlin, which sits within the Russian zone, had a similar arrangement, but unfortunately they used different language and they didn't call it zones, they called it sectors. So you've got, again, the yellow is the American sector, that was actually in the southwest, and the French sector in the north and the British sector in the middle there. So those three sectors all in the west, and of course the Soviet sector in the east. Okay, so there's the map. Useful map. It's quite nicely laid out, that map, to understand that. Let's on then. Okay, so the Potsdam Conference of July 1945. So we got as far as the Yalta. So in the lesson yesterday, we just started off with a quick recap of what we covered in Yalta, just to make sure you're comfortable of it. Now, of course, the beauty of a YouTube video in comparison to a lesson is you can actually shut me up when I speak too much. So I won't read these slides to you. Unlike in a lesson, you can actually pause me. So pause me if you wish, and have a quick read, just to remind you of the two, in a nutshell, points. And then the recap. So let's just go through these points. Okay, so again, you've got the map there, which is a useful reference point. So what do we now know? And I think that's an important phrase there. We now know. Okay, we now know. Emphasize that. And of course, what we're talking here is this key word. The word is, which you should try to use when you're writing essays. Historians have the advantage of hindsight, and I say sometimes it's an advantage, often it's a disadvantage, and in this sense it is a disadvantage. As a historian, we need to try to see and understand the events as they were seen and understand at the time. Now, the disadvantage is, of course, we now know that 4 years later, in 1949, Germany was divided into two countries. Okay, so it was divided into West Germany, called the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, called the German Democratic Republic. Okay, and we now know that division basically became a long-term division. It lasted 41 years until 1990. And we now know that the immediate reason that Germany split into two countries was a result of developing Cold War tensions at the end of World War II. In particular, the Berlin blockade crisis of 1948, or you could say it was also the Czech crisis of 1948, But in a sense, the seeds of the Cold War were growing from even during World War II. The seeds of the Cold War, tensions between the capitalist West and the communist East were growing. Had started to grow even before World War II had ended. But the specific reason that Germany split was the Cold War. Okay, and we now know, of course, that when we talk about West Germany, okay, when we speak about West Germany was created from the Western military occupation zones, okay, the American, the British and the French zones, and that East Germany was created from the Russian occupation zone. Okay. But, this is the hindsight point, that was not known at the time in 1945 to 1999. It was not known that Germany was going to become divided, okay? And in fact, on the contrary, and I'm going to be emphasising this point time and time again because it's so important you understand it, on the contrary, nobody really wanted Germany to become divided, and least of all, Stalin, okay? It's often a sort of huge misconception in history, in schools, and in particular, you tend to get it quite a lot at GCSE, where the textbooks are a bit simplistic on this. And the assumption is that Stalin always wanted to have an East Germany because it would expand Soviet frontiers westwards, Soviet influence westwards. No. It's not that really was a long way from the truth. But we'll pick that one up as we go through later lessons. So there's that point. There was a willingness at the time, in 1945, by all four occupied powers to keep Germany as a unified whole country. Okay, why? Because of World War One. Because they remembered what basically the damage had been caused at the end of World War One. The people of 1945. Like us, we have hindsight. Well, they had hindsight, okay, and their hindsight was of the experience of the First World War. And what had they seen happen? They had seen basically at the end of World War One, they had punished Germany, they had crushed Germany economically with a harsh reparations policy, and it plunged into chaos. There was almost a revolution in 1919. There was economic chaos with the hyperinflation, and ultimately her inability to pay reparations, etc., resulted in political division that resulted in the rise to power of Hitler, that led to an aggressive fascist country that waged a war of expansion eastwards for the second time. Because Germany had attacked Russia in 1914, and now it happened again in 1941, that plunged Europe into chaos for many, many years. So everybody understood that really for future peace, it was important to not have a dead, crushed country in the middle of Europe, that something had to be done to restore Germany to some form of position where her huge wealth, remember the Ruhr, Europe's biggest industrial area was in Germany. Her manufacturing capability was important for trade, and a strong Germany in the centre of Europe was important for future peace. A happy Germany. So, but how do you manage this was the sort of issue that they needed to sort of think through. But there was a general willingness that the worst thing to do was basically to break Germany into little bits. Okay, it needed to be managed somehow. So it was agreed in 1945 at Yalta that that until a peace treaty was agreed. Until a peace treaty was agreed, that Germany would basically be managed by the military leaders of the four powers that had fought together on the same side against Germany during the Second World War. And The four military chiefs, the British, the French, the American, and the Russian, were called the Allied Control Council. So the military commanders of the four occupying powers would form a council that would meet in Berlin, and any decisions, all decisions, would be made by that small committee of four men until a peace treaty had been agreed. Now, again, here's another lesson from the First World War that they learned. World War I ended in November 1918. It took 7 or 8 months before the political leaders at the time, the foreign ministers basically, because remember the foreign ministers met at Paris, there was a Paris Peace Conference. It wasn't until June 1919, it took 7 or 8 months before they were able to thrash out a peace treaty called the Treaty of Versailles. In the meantime, in that 7 or 8 months, Germany was in chaos. There was the Freikorps, and there was civil conflict and political conflict. So, kind of like learning from the past, they realised it was important to manage Germany, and the only people on the spot to manage Germany in the meantime, until the peace treaty was agreed, were the soldiers, were the military commanders. So Germany was under military occupation that would be managed by a military council that would make all of the decisions. Okay, so those are the sort of key points there. Now, move on. So there, we're now on to the Potsdam. So again, I don't need to read that to you. You can pause it, but just have a quick read of, in a nutshell, of what we're going to cover in this next section of the mind map. So what are the key points? Okay, the big three met again in Potsdam. Okay, met again because they had previously met in February in Yalta, but this is a different context, and completely different context. I mean, the main thing is when they met at Yalta in February, the war was still being waged. Hitler still had, at that time, Yalta had controlled most of Germany. At that time, Russian troops were pushing into Poland, and British and American troops had just crossed over into Germany in the west, but the war was still being waged, and the Yalta Conference was held on the Yalta's on the Black Sea, a resort on the Black Sea coast in Russia. Now, in July 1945, the war is over in Europe. Okay, it hasn't ended in the Far East yet, but it's over in Europe. So the two Allied forces have basically met in the centre of Germany. The Soviet Union has pushed in from the east, and the British and the Americans have pushed in from the west, and they met in the centre of Germany, and Hitler's killed himself. So Germany is under military occupation, so there's no need to call a conference in some foreign resort. They basically called the conference in Berlin, and Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin. Now, the fractures that would eventually lead to the Cold War were now becoming apparent. Now, again, I'm speaking with hindsight there. They didn't know there was going to be a Cold War, okay? But they likewise could clearly see that there were tensions. It had a different feel, a different tone from Yalta that had happened 5 months earlier. And a big part of that was the different people, okay, that were at the conference. The one constant was Stalin. He'd been there at Yalta, but President Roosevelt had died, so the new American president, Harry S. Truman, who was much more hard-line attitude towards the Soviet forces, represented America, and Winston Churchill had been the Conservatives in the general election. The Conservatives had been voted out, and Clement Attlee, the Labour minister, the Labour leader, was voted in. The Conservatives weren't really voted out because it was a wartime coalition, but Churchill did not win the election of 1945, so the Labour leader, Clement Attlee, was at the conference. Okay, so those are the sort of key changes that are noted in that third bullet point. And also, by that particular stage, Europe has effectively been liberated by the Allied forces. Okay, what that basically meant is that the Soviet Union had occupied, in the sense that they had pushed the Nazis out of Eastern Europe, and they had been welcomed into Eastern European countries as liberators. So they'd gone into Poland and to Romania, etc., as liberators. And early, at the previous conferences, Stalin had had said yes, that he would allow free elections and that the Soviet forces would not stay there, and the people of these countries would be allowed to, would obviously be prepared to have their own elections. But the reality was very different, is that Stalin was using the Soviet presence, and if I just move over to a map, okay, so you can clearly see the division of Europe there, and the red areas are the areas which had been liberated by the Soviet Union, so Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia had been liberated by the Soviet Union. And the map is a future map, because it actually says East Germany and West Germany, which of course didn't exist at that time, but I think hopefully you get the point. And so the Soviet Union used the advantage that they had. They did call elections, they did allow elections in each of these countries, because remember, the Nazis had basically removed, killed, murdered their political leaders, government leaders. So there were elections so that these countries could form their own governments, but of course they were manipulated, arguably. I mean, Stalin would have protested and said no, he wasn't manipulating, but it was basically known that the communist parties of each of those countries were given a nudge and a support into power. And in some places the communist parties would have won a lot of votes anyway, in the context of poor countries repressed at the end of the war. But certainly there was manipulation and election rigging going on. And perhaps Stalin would have privately said, well, he had every right to do that, because he needed basically to create a buffer, a protective buffer between the West and the Soviet Union, because twice in the 20th century Germany had launched an aggressive attack against the Soviet Union, and you've got to get into Stalin's mindset. He felt deeply threatened, and here was an opportunity to sort of like establish Soviet influence over Eastern Europe, so that Eastern Europe would become a buffer, a protective cushion zone. Okay, but the point is that Potsdam, Attlee and Truman were aware that this was happening, so that was a seed of discontent. So in terms of stretch reading, and this is so important, of course, that you do this, really, really important. Okay, remember that you read around partly to deepen your knowledge, to consolidate your understanding, but also to learn how good historians write. Okay, so you're learning the language and how to write academically. Williamson is good. Okay, and there's an extract on pages 7 to 8 of Williamson, and also Carr, page 367. The best is Turner, and you've got the scan of the original Turner, so read the original, okay? But you've also got my notes, and in my notes, then go to point 4, and again, you can read that now, okay? You can pause and read it now and make a few notes now. And point 5. But you've got those notes, okay? Because Turner adds a lot of more detail and useful information that isn't included in the textbook, and we're looking to sort of raise your game on this and to really deepen your knowledge and understanding. So those are the key points about Potsdam from Turner. Let's continue. Okay, so the need for unanimity. Unanimity means there has to be a unanimous agreement, and also the temporary nature of Potsdam. So what are the key points here? It was agreed at Potsdam that the Allied Control Council, which is the 4 military commanders, that any decision about the zones that they occupied had to be unanimous, okay, and that a decision once made had to be administered in the same way by the 4 occupying powers in their zones. So in other words, they said, look, you can't have the Americans doing one thing in their zone and the Soviet Union doing another thing in their zone. Okay, so if we make a decision, whatever it may be, about a curfew and lights out at whatever time, then that has to be a unanimous decision agreed by all 4 of us, and then we've all got to implement it equally. Okay, so that was very much came from the sort of like the understanding is that we've got to really work together to keep a united whole Germany. Okay, we can't start treating our zones in different ways. Okay, crucial point. And in the meantime, until the peace treaty was signed, they reiterated, and it started to now happen. They said, look, we'll divide Germany into zones. It will be a temporary arrangement, and there will be military zones purely for administrative purposes. But to reiterate, we do not treat our zones differently from the others. We reach agreement together in the Control Council in Berlin, and administer them our zones according to what we've decided in the Control Council. Okay, so each sector, each zone, and of course, the same applied to Berlin, because Berlin was divided into sectors, even that was to be administered by the relevant occupying army, following the instructions of the ACC in Berlin. Always intended to be a temporary arrangement, okay? So they're saying, look, we have to manage the country until the foreign ministers have reached agreement about a peace treaty, okay? Now, of course, we now know, again, go back to that hindsight issue, that the foreign ministers never reached agreement. Well, they did eventually. They reached agreement in the year 1990. Okay, and we go back to World War One. It took the foreign ministers 7 or 8 months to reach agreement at the end of World War One, which was seen at then it was seen to be, oh God, what's taking them so long to do it? But they eventually did it, because they argued, but that was nothing compared to the end of World War II. It took them 45 years to reach an agreement. Why did it take them so long? Because the Cold War happened. The Cold War was that huge, great big bombshell that landed in the middle of everything, and it stopped the countries talking to each other. Okay, so that's a key point. Now, tensions were arising between these men at Potsdam. And they were aware of that at the time, and the tensions were in particular about reparations. Okay, there was an acknowledgement that we can't sort of like crush Germany so that she becomes a dead shell in the middle of Europe, because that will be to no one's advantage. Okay, but also quite rightly, there was an acknowledgement that in particular the French, but especially Russia, needed compensation because their countries had been invaded by the Germans, and the damage that had been caused to their countries in terms of the loss of life, in terms of the damage to the infrastructure and farming and industry in particular, basically meant that they had a right for reparations. But at the same time, they were aware that the reparations issue in World War One, where Germany had been charged £6.6 billion, hadn't worked. It had resulted in the rise to power of Hitler. So a lot of conversation about reparations. So what does you need to know about reparations? Reparations were to be extracted from Germany in the form of machines and industrial equipment. That was agreed at Potsdam. And they learnt from World War One, not monetary payments, okay, because they wanted to avoid the economic instability that happened after World War One, okay. And so it was agreed at Potsdam that each occupying power had the right to remove factories and equipment from their zone and take them back to their own countries. Okay, so that was agreed. The issue is, though, that most of Germany's industry, think about the Ruhr area, lay in the western zones, and in particular the Ruhr was in the British zone in the west. So they talked about this at Potsdam, and it was agreed that the Americans and the British would turn over a proportion of their reparations to Russia, because Russia had the right to have factories and equipment from Germany. So they agreed that 15% of the British and American reparations would be given over to Russia. Okay, and in return, the Russian zone in the east was heavily agricultural. There was a lot more farming, agriculture in the eastern zone, and there was far less agriculture in the western zones. Again, you know that. Think the eastern zone, the Russian zone, was the old Prussia. And Prussia had these huge, great big landowners, the Junker farms, etc., etc. So it was agreed that Russia would turn over a proportion of her foodstuffs to the western zones, to the British and the Americans and the French, because, of course, there were millions of starving Germans who had to be fed, and most of Germany's big cities were in the west, which was occupied by the British, the Americans and the French, and so they needed a feed, so therefore a sort of a mutual agreement, okay? So a proportion of the reparations industry would be given by the British, the French and Americans to the Soviet Union, and in return the Soviet Union would give a proportion of food over to the British, the French and the Americans, okay? So that was agreed. All four victors also agreed that it was important in the long term to prepare the Germans for self-rule, okay? So they agreed to allow the revival of elections in their zones in which the German people could choose representatives to take part in some form of government. And the government, this obviously, of course, needed to be managed, because the problem is that the German people have gone through 12 years of Nazi rule, in which many young adults or middle-aged adults in Germany now have gone through an indoctrination process by Hitler in schools and Hitler Youth. So clearly, how do you manage the elections? But it was agreed that in the long term it was important that Germany be allowed to form political parties and start to take part in elections. And likewise, they had the right for trade unions in their zones. And of course, Hitler, on the 6th of May 1933, had crushed Germany's trade unions, but it was agreed that workers' rights was important, a representation against their employers, so trade unions should be allowed to be formed. So we've got to manage a process where Germans can start to make their own decisions again. Okay, so that would mean that Germany would have to be allowed to form administrative organisations, and it was important that Nazis were not allowed to take place in that. But how do you decide who the Nazis were, etc., etc.? Okay. And this would start at local level, okay, and eventually become more centralised. But it would be a piecemeal process. It would take a long time. But clearly there wasn't enough manpower by the occupying forces to manage everything. So therefore, would gradually bring Germans back into their own decision-making processes. Okay, so all of those arrangements were intended to be merely temporary. Okay, until a peace conference of foreign ministers had met and had decided the long-term future of Germany. Okay, so growing tensions. Okay, because behind all of this, over the next 4 years, the situation changed, and we keep talking about the emerging Cold War. and its impact on Germany. So that's what we've covered so far. Okay, so you can again pause that and have a quick look. And now we're going on to growing tensions, and again there, in a nutshell, is what we're going to cover in the next section. Pause it and have a look. So what are the points? There's the map again that we've looked at. So growing tensions. The problem was, over the next 3 or 4 years, the American zone moved much faster than the other zones in implementing what had agreed could happen at Potsdam, okay, that the German people should be prepared for democracy. So in the American zone, they moved on that very, very quickly. And very quickly, we start to see German politicians getting positions in administration. So, for example, in January 1946, okay, which is just half a year or just over half a year since the end of the war, Germans in the American zone were allowed to vote for local councils. Okay. In March 1946, Germans were allowed to vote in town and county elections. Okay, so very rapid process at the local level. Try to imagine a sort of pyramid there. You've got the local level, and that's the bottom of the pyramid, the sort of village and town and county elections. So councils were formed in which the Germans are now starting to make their own decisions. Okay. Now, you imagine that sort of pyramid concept. So there is there's the local level. The next level up there is the state level. Okay, do you remember? Obviously, we've covered this many times in the past. That Germany historically had state governments. So it didn't take too long before the Americans now started to reconstruct the old federal state system. And in June 1946, in the American zone, elections were held in which state governments were formed, elected by Germans, and the people that formed the state governments and the state parliaments, remember the old state parliaments, they're now back. Okay, and that started to happen in the American zone. Okay, and it didn't take too long before the British followed suit, and the British did the same in their zones in May 1947. And it didn't take too long before the French followed suit. So Stalin's watching this, and he's getting very anxious. Okay, he's thinking, well, okay, we did allow this at Potsdam, but they're moving much more quickly. And of course, from Stalin's point of view, he is anxious because these Germans who have been given influence and now are having votes again, and okay, it hasn't got to the top level, the central level yet, but hey, how long before that happens? And Stalin's anxious that these Germans, who in his mind are still indoctrinated with dangerous Nazi ideas, that the West is preparing the way for effectively what could be another Hitler. How long? And if that happens, then Germany. How long before Germany suddenly attacks Russia again? But it had been agreed at Potsdam this could happen, and Stalin likewise in his zone followed suit, and there were elections. They were not so democratic though, because Stalin did in his zone what he was doing in the other occupied countries in the East. And so there was manipulation happening, and Stalin was basically ensuring that the Communist Party, which was effectively renamed and called the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, remember, because it was forcibly merged with the Social Democratic Party in the Eastern Zone, was winning the elections in their area. Now, there's a nice little map there. So on the left, you've got the map that we looked at. And, of course, over here, you can see then, and this was 1947, as you can see. And you can see that effectively the old federal states are now reappearing. Okay, so Germany is still under military occupation, but at state level there are state governments elected by Germans consisting of German politicians from German political parties. So you can see the names of the states. So, you know, the American zone was Bavaria and Hesse and Württemberg and so on and so forth. Okay, so shown as a map. In addition, significant tensions were now developing between, on one side, America, Britain and France, and the Soviet Union on the other, over the issue of Germany's economic recovery. Okay, so you've got these tensions about the voting and moving too quickly on self-rule, which is making Stalin very anxious. But now you've got an additional tension. Okay, and they had made an agreement about reparations at Potsdam, fine, but we've now got an issue. Okay, and it is this: the Americans and the British, okay, started breaking the Potsdam Agreement, and unilaterally, in other words, by themselves. Because remember, every decision was supposed to be made in the Control Council and it had to be unanimous, so the Soviet Union had to agree everything as well. But by themselves, they started working hard to foster German industrial recovery in their zones. Okay? Now, why did they do that? In particular, more than anything else, it was particularly pushed by the British, but also the American, but particularly the British. Use the British as an example, okay? There is the British zone there in green, okay? And remember, sitting in the middle of the British zone is the Ruhr, okay? It is the Ruhr area there, shown in yellow, is Europe's biggest industrial region. Okay, big cities, millions of German workers. They need to be fed. Okay, and Britain is maintaining an occupying force and providing for the Germans. They need to be fed because otherwise you're going to have civil unrest. Is being paid for by the British taxpayers. Okay, and okay, they've made part of the Reparations Agreement is that the Russians will provide food from their zone. But the bottom line is that it is an expensive deal maintaining an occupying force in Germany, and in particular for Britain. Britain had other problems elsewhere. Okay, back home, she wants to rebuild her own cities that have been bombed. That costs a lot of money. Okay, and here are British taxpayers basically paying their taxes, and the government is using that money to help the Germans. Likewise, over in India, India was in open revolution basically, and India was a British colony, and if anywhere, the British wanted to get their troops out of Germany and send them over to India to maintain order in India. So basically the British are saying, look, we need to give Germany back to the Germans, get them managing their own affairs and get their industry working again so that they can manufacture goods, they can sell their goods, start trading and use the revenue from trade to buy food themselves rather than us having to sort of like pay for everything. Okay, so that was basically the sort of mood that was happening. Okay, and that's the sort of point that we made there in that particular bullet point. So the Americans and the British in particular in their zones are fostering industrial recovery. How does Stalin feel about that? Okay, well, this is the country that 2 years earlier the Allies were at war with, and that this is the country that had been led by the Nazis that had waged a huge destructive war against the Soviet Union. And now, within 2 years, the British and the Americans are talking about getting out. They're talking about handing self-rule back to the Germans and allowing them to take control over the factories, in Stalin's head, well, how long then before the Germans are making weapons and they've elected a new leader who will basically relaunch a war against the Soviet Union? So Stalin, for good reason, accused America and Britain of violating the Potsdam Agreement. Okay, and so in the Allied Control Council, he exercised his veto. He said, every decision is unanimous. I'm basically blocking your actions. Okay, so you can see here the Potsdam Agreement is starting to break down. So, supplementary reading on that. Williamson, pages 15 to 17. And again, Turner. And I really emphasise the point, read the original. You've got the scanned chapter. Okay, that's the beauty of reading, is that you learn how to write history. So don't just rely on my notes. But here on my notes, you've got hard copies, and if you want to pause it, I'll zoom in for you. But here is what Turner says about these points there, and there. But you've got your notes as well. And there. That's the bit about the reconstitution of the Länder, the German states. Next, the German political parties. Okay, so as we've said, it had been agreed Germany should be allowed to form, start to engage with politics again and form political parties. So that's what we've covered far, and there, again, you can pause it, is in a nutshell what we're going to cover in this section about political parties. Okay, so we're just introducing something here that we're going to go into in a lot more detail in the next few lessons, okay, as we work on this fourth depth study. But basically, in the Western zones, okay, in the Western zones, two main parties emerged, okay. First of all, the old SPD, the old Social Democratic Party that the Nazis had crushed in 1933, was reformed. Okay, so representing the German working classes, and the leader was this man here, Karl Schumacher. We'll do a whole lesson on him, so I won't talk about him now. Okay, spent most of World War II in a concentration camp. Like many SPD leaders, had been arrested at the beginning of the Nazi regime. Not a well man. He had been he'd been treated badly and was very ill, but a very popular man. So the SPD did well in elections early on. The second main party to emerge were called the Christian Democratic Union, led by this man, Konrad Adenauer. And Adenauer, I think he was 73 even then, in 1946, when the party emerged. So a well-established politician. I mean, he had been a politician in Imperial Germany. He was actually the mayor of, I think, Cologne at the time of the German Revolution of 1919, you know, when the Spartacists were out on the streets of Germany. He was an active politician then. He was an active politician in the Weimar Republic, and he was a centre party politician. Okay, so again, we'll do much more about him because he eventually became Germany's first post-war chancellor. So we'll do a lot about him. Okay, and the CDU were a sort of confederation of several political groups that wanted to work together. So the members of the CDU were sort of drawn from the old Catholic Centre Party, but also the old German Nationalist Party and other sort of populist politicians at the grassroots level. But they were very different from the old Centre Party. Adenauer himself was a Catholic, but it represented both Catholic and Protestant middle-class voters. It was very much a middle-class party, so it drew its support from the north and south of Germany. Remember, the old Centre Party tended to be mainly sort of like the Catholic regions, which were sort of more in the south and the west, but the CDU was more across the whole of Germany, and it represented the values of a new phenomenon called Christian socialism, which will sort of develop more in future lessons. And don't confuse the CDU with another party called the CSU, which was the Christian Social Union. Okay, that was a separate Bavarian party, but it shared many of the same ideals of the CDU. So basically, it worked with the CDU. And when you read about this, therefore, the textbooks, the historians will often talk about the union. If they're talking about the union, they are talking about the CDU and the CSU working together in tandem, which was a common feature. So a lot of books simply talk about the CDU stroke CSU, just so you're aware of that in your reading. So those are the German political parties in the western zones. As I said, in the eastern zone, remember, there were political parties. Stalin allowed political parties, but they were very much rigged. And remember, he forcibly merged the communists and the SPD into one big party. And that was called the Socialist Unity Party, or the SED, but that was in the eastern zone. Lots of reading there for you on the German political parties. Williamson, pages 21 to 24. Go back to Carr, 368 to 371. And Turner again. Go to my notes, but read the original, pages 16 to 22, The Revival of German Politics. So again, if you wanted to do it now straight on the YouTube video, I'll just zoom in for you so you can pause and read. Okay. So, we've covered a lot there. Relations breaking down, not going particularly well in Germany for all these reasons. In the meantime, ticking away in the background, everyone's waiting for the foreign ministers to get their heads together. But the problem is, because of all these underlying tensions, it ain't going to happen, basically. They did meet together in 1947, but because of these tensions, because basically Stalin was outraged at the Americans and the British fostering industrial recovery and etc., Stalin walked out of the conference. So the conference in London pushed ahead without the Soviet Union. So so the British and the French and the Americans and leaders of the various, what we call the Benelux countries, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, etc., countries that had been invaded by Germany at the end of the war, they all had a right to a say in the peace treaty, in what was going to happen. They met, but without the most important country there, the Soviet Union. So there's the usual slide. Those are the points we've covered. The London Conference in a nutshell. So again, you can pause it and read it. So at the London Conference from February to June 1948, the USA and 5 countries, Britain, France, Belgium, Netherlands and Luxembourg, met without the Soviet Union there. And it was at that conference in early 1948, the conclusion was reached now that it is likely that we're going to have a divided Germany. So the mood has changed from 1945. Okay, there was a sense of resignation that, well, clearly relations between East and West are breaking down, and the Potsdam Agreement is breaking down. We can't afford to simply do nothing. Stalin's not going to work with us because he's not happy with what we're doing. So we're just going to have to proceed to do things our way in our zones. And what that's likely to mean is we're going to have to basically, remember that sort of idea of the pyramid. We have given local decision making first at the bottom level, and now we've escalated that to the German states. The next level up is to form a national government, but clearly if we're going to form a national government, it's going to have to be only in the western zones. We want to get out of Germany and give Germany back to the Germans, and we're going to have to basically do it in the West. So they concluded that this would mean the creation of permanent democratic institutions in the western half of Germany that would have to move up to the top level. So a centrally elected German government. So as a result, in July 1948, again, you think the middle level is the state governments. It was agreed the task would be handed over to the state governments, okay, the ministers, the leaders of the state governments in the western zones, to begin discussions on creating a national government that would unfortunately have to exclude Germans living in the eastern military zone. So that was the decision that was made. Okay, so that takes us then up to June 1948, and that prepares the way for next lesson, when we will look at in more detail the decision to divide Germany. So there's your supplementary reading and note making on the London Conference, Williamson 27 to 30, also Carr 371. And go to Turner 22 to 32. If you look at my notes, Germany is the focus of the Cold War. You will find supplementary information there in points 1, 2 and point 3. So again, you can read that now. There's the completed picture. All in a nutshell on one page for you. So next lesson, or the next two lessons, okay, we will, next time we meet, look at the decision to create a Western Germany in 1948 to 49, and then we will look at the basic law, which was the West German Constitution. Okay, but before that, the decision to create a West Germany, and that in particular will look at the Berlin blockade and airlift. So this is the lesson where we really do start getting properly into depth study 4. Okay, everything we've done so far is just sort of the background to help you understand Germany 1949 to 1960, which is what the fourth depth study is about. And you can see that then after that we'll move into Adenauer and the CDU and Schumacher and denazification, which are all the topics that make it depth study 4. So there we go. Hopefully that was useful to Jess and Caitlin and Tom, who missed yesterday's lesson, but anybody else who's watching this video, whoever you may be, and at whatever time this may be, I hope that was useful for you. Thank you very much. I will sign out now.